3 essays on the theory of sexuality. I. The sexual aberrations 1. The fact of the existence of sexual needs in human beings and animals is expressed in biology by the assumption of a sexual instinct, on the analogy of the instinct of nutrition, that is of hunger. Everyday language possesses no counterpart to the word hunger, but science makes use of the word libido for that purpose. Point 2. Popular opinion has quite definite ideas about the nature and characteristics of this sexual instinct. It is generally understood to be absent in childhood, to set in at the time of puberty in connection with the process of coming to maturity, and to be revealed in the manifestations of an irresistible attraction exercised by one sex upon the other, while its aim is presumed to be sexual union, or at all events actions leading in that direction. We have every reason to believe, however, that these views give a very false picture of the true situation. If we look into them more closely, we shall find that they contain a number of errors, inaccuracies, and hasty conclusions. I shall at this point introduce 2 technical terms. Let us call the person from whom sexual attraction precedes the sexual object, and the act towards which the instinct tends the sexual aim. Scientifically sifted observation, then, shows that numerous deviations occur in respect of both of these, the sexual object and the sexual aim. The relation between these deviations and what is assumed to be normal requires thorough investigation. 1. Deviations in respect of the sexual object. The popular view of the sexual instinct is beautifully reflected in the poetic fable which tells how the original human beings were cut up into 2 halves, man and woman, and how these are always striving to unite again in love. 1. It comes as a great surprise therefore to learn that there are men whose sexual object is a man and not a woman, and women whose sexual object is a woman and not a man. People of this kind are described as having contrary sexual feelings, or better, as being inverts, and the fact is described as inversion. The number of such people is very considerable, though there are difficulties in establishing it precisely. Point 2. A. Inversion. Behavior of inverts. Such people vary greatly in their behavior in several respects. A. They may be absolute inverts. In that case, their sexual objects are exclusively of their own sex. Persons of the opposite sex are never the object of their sexual desire, but leave them cold, or even arouse sexual aversion in them. As a consequence of this aversion, they are incapable, if they are men, of carrying out the sexual act, or else they derive no enjoyment from it. B. They may be amphigenic inverts, that is psychosexual hermaphrodites. In that case, their sexual objects may equally well be of their own or of the opposite sex. This kind of inversion thus lacks the characteristic of exclusiveness. C. They may be contingent inverts. In that case, under certain external conditions of which inaccessibility of any normal sexual object and imitation are the chief, they are capable of taking as their sexual object someone of their own sex and of deriving satisfaction from sexual intercourse with him. Again, inverts vary in their views as to the peculiarity of their sexual instinct. Some of them accept their inversion as something in the natural course of things, just as a normal person accepts the direction of his libido, and insist energetically that inversion is as legitimate as the normal attitude. Others rebel against their inversion and feel it as a pathological compulsion. Point 1. Other variations occur which relate to questions of time. The trait of inversion may either date back to the very beginning, as far back as the subject's memory reaches, or it may not have become noticeable till some particular time before or after puberty. 2. It may either persist throughout life, or it may go into temporary abeyance, or again it may constitute an episode on the way to a normal development. It may even make its first appearance late in life after a long period of normal sexual activity. A periodic oscillation between a normal and an inverted sexual object has also sometimes been observed. Those cases are of particular interest in which the libido changes over to an inverted sexual object after a distressing experience with a normal one. As a rule, these different kinds of variations are found side by side independently of one another. It is, however, safe to assume that the most extreme form of inversion will have been present from a very early age and that the person concerned will feel at one with his peculiarity. Many authorities would be unwilling to class together all the various cases which I have enumerated and would prefer to lay stress upon their differences rather than their resemblances, in accordance with their own preferred view of inversion. Nevertheless, though the distinctions cannot be disputed, it is impossible to overlook the existence of numerous intermediate examples of every type, so that we are driven to conclude that we are dealing with a connected series. Nature of inversion. The earliest assessments regarded inversion as an innate indication of nervous degeneracy. This corresponded to the fact that medical observers first came across it in persons suffering, or appearing to suffer, from nervous diseases. This characterization of inversion involves 2 suppositions, which must be considered separately, that it is innate and that it is degenerate. Degeneracy. The attribution of degeneracy in this connection is open to the objections which can be raised against the indiscriminate use of the word in general. It has become the fashion to regard any symptom which is not obviously due to trauma or infection as a sign of degeneracy. Magnan's classification of degenerates is indeed of such a kind as not to exclude the possibility of the concept of degeneracy being applied to a nervous system whose general functioning is excellent. This being so, it may well be asked whether an attribution of degeneracy is of any value or adds anything to our knowledge. It seems wiser only to speak of it where 1. Several serious deviations from the normal are found together, and 2. The capacity for efficient functioning and survival seem to be severely impaired. Point 1. Several facts go to show that in this legitimate sense of the word inverts cannot be regarded as degenerate. 1. Inversion is found in people who exhibit no other serious deviations from the normal. 2. It is similarly found in people whose efficiency is unimpaired, and who are indeed distinguished by specially high intellectual development and ethical culture. Point 1. 3. If we disregard the patients we come across in our medical practice, and cast our eyes round a wider horizon, we shall come in 2 directions upon facts which make it impossible to regard inversion as a sign of degeneracy. A. Account must be taken of the fact that inversion was a frequent phenomenon, one might almost say an institution charged with important functions among the peoples of antiquity at the height of their civilization. B. It is remarkably widespread among many savage and primitive races, whereas the concept of degeneracy is usually restricted to states of high civilization, cf. Bloch, and, even amongst the civilized peoples of Europe, climate and race exercise the most powerful influence on the prevalence of inversion and upon the attitude adopted towards it. Point 2. Innate character. As may be supposed, innateness is only attributed to the first, most extreme, class of inverts, and the evidence for it rests upon assurances given by them that at no time in their lives has their sexual instinct shown any sign of taking another course. The very existence of the 2 other classes, and especially the third, the contingent inverts, is difficult to reconcile with the hypothesis of the innateness of inversion. This explains why those who support this view tend to separate out the group of absolute inverts from all the rest, thus abandoning any attempt at giving an account of inversion which shall have universal application. In the view of these authorities, inversion is innate in one group of cases, while in others it may have come about in other ways. The reverse of this view is represented by the alternative one that inversion is an acquired character of the sexual instinct. This second view is based on the following considerations. 1. In the case of many inverts, even absolute ones, it is possible to show that very early in their lives a sexual impression occurred which left a permanent after effect in the shape of a tendency to homosexuality. 2. In the case of many others, it is possible to point to external influences in their lives, whether of a favorable or inhibiting character, which have led sooner or later to a fixation of their inversion. Such influences are exclusive relations with persons of their own sex, comradeship in war, detention in prison, the dangers of heterosexual intercourse, celibacy, sexual weakness, etc. 3. Inversion can be removed by hypnotic suggestion, which would be astonishing in an innate characteristic. In view of these considerations, it is even possible to doubt the very existence of such a thing as innate inversion. It can be argued, cf. Havelock Ellis 1915, that, if the cases of allegedly innate inversion were more closely examined, some experience of their early childhood would probably come to light which had a determining effect upon the direction taken by their libido. This experience would simply have passed out of the subject's conscious recollection, but could be recalled to his memory under appropriate influence. In the opinion of these writers, inversion can only be described as a frequent variation of the sexual instinct, which can be determined by a number of external circumstances in the subject's life. The apparent certainty of this conclusion is, however, completely countered by the reflection that many people are subjected to the same sexual influences, e.g. to seduction or mutual masturbation, which may occur in early youth, without becoming inverted or without remaining so permanently. We are therefore forced to a suspicion that the choice between innate and acquired is not an exclusive one, or that it does not cover all the issues involved in inversion. Explanation of inversion. The nature of inversion is explained neither by the hypothesis that it is innate nor by the alternative hypothesis that it is acquired. In the former case, we must ask in what respect it is innate, unless we are to accept the crude explanation that everyone is born with his sexual instinct attached to a particular sexual object. In the latter case, it may be questioned whether the various accidental influences would be sufficient to explain the acquisition of inversion without the cooperation of something in the subject himself. As we have already shown, the existence of this last factor is not to be denied. Bisexuality. A fresh contradiction of popular views is involved in the considerations put forward by Lidston 1889, Kiernan 1888 and Chevalier 1893 in an endeavor to account for the possibility of sexual inversion. It is popularly believed that a human being is either a man or a woman. Science, however, knows of cases in which the sexual characters are obscured, and in which it is consequently difficult to determine the sex. This arises in the first instance in the field of anatomy. The genitals of the individuals concerned combine male and female characteristics. This condition is known as hermaphroditism. In rare cases, both kinds of sexual apparatus are found side by side fully developed, true hermaphroditism, but far more frequently both sets of organs are found in an atrophied condition. Point 1. The importance of these abnormalities lies in the unexpected fact that they facilitate our understanding of normal development. For it appears that a certain degree of anatomical hermaphroditism occurs normally. In every normal male or female individual, traces are found of the apparatus of the opposite sex. These either persist without function as rudimentary organs or become modified and take on other functions. These long familiar facts of anatomy lead us to suppose that an originally bisexual physical disposition has, in the course of evolution, become modified into a unisexual one, leaving behind only a few traces of the sex that has become atrophied. It was tempting to extend this hypothesis to the mental sphere and to explain inversion in all its varieties as the expression of a psychical hermaphroditism. All that was required further in order to settle the question was that inversion should be regularly accompanied by the mental and somatic signs of hermaphroditism. But this expectation was disappointed. It is impossible to demonstrate so close a connection between the hypothetical psychical hermaphroditism and the established anatomical one. A general lowering of the sexual instinct and a slight anatomical atrophy of the organs is found frequently in inverts, cf. Havelock Ellis, 1915. Frequently, but by no means regularly or even usually. The truth must therefore be recognized that inversion and somatic hermaphroditism are on the whole independent of each other. A great deal of importance, too, has been attached to what are called the secondary and tertiary sexual characters and to the great frequency of the occurrence of those of the opposite sex in inverts, cf. Havelock Ellis, 1915. Much of this, again, is correct, but it should never be forgotten that in general the secondary and tertiary sexual characters of one sex occur very frequently in the opposite one. They are indications of hermaphroditism, but are not attended by any change of sexual object in the direction of inversion. Psychical hermaphroditism would gain substance if the inversion of the sexual object were at least accompanied by a parallel changeover of the subject's other mental qualities, instincts, and character traits into those marking the opposite sex. But it is only in inverted women that character inversion of this kind can be looked for with any regularity. In men the most complete mental masculinity can be combined with inversion. If the belief in psychical hermaphroditism is to be persisted in, it will be necessary to add that its manifestations in various spheres show only slight signs of being mutually determined. Moreover, the same is true of somatic hermaphroditism. According to Halvin, 1903, one occurrences of individual atrophied organs and of secondary sexual characters are to a considerable extent independent of one another. The theory of bisexuality has been expressed in its crudest form by a spokesman of the male inverts, a feminine brain in a masculine body. But we are ignorant of what characterizes a feminine brain. There is neither need nor justification for replacing the psychological problem by the anatomical one. Kraft-Heping's attempted explanation seems to be more exactly framed than that of Ulrich's but does not differ from it in essentials. According to Kraft-Heping, 1895, 5, every individual's bisexual disposition endows him with masculine and feminine brain centers as well as with somatic organs of sex. These centers develop only at puberty, for the most part under the influence of the sex gland, which is independent of them in the original disposition. But what has just been said of masculine and feminine brains applies equally to masculine and feminine centers, and incidentally we have not even any grounds for assuming that certain areas of the brain, centers, are set aside for the functions of sex, as is the case, for instance, with those of speech. Point 1. Nevertheless, two things emerge from these discussions. In the first place, a bisexual disposition is somehow concerned in inversion, though we do not know in what that disposition consists, beyond anatomical structure. And secondly, we have to deal with disturbances that affect the sexual instinct in the course of its development. Sexual object of inverts. The theory of psychical hermaphroditism presupposes that the sexual object of an invert is the opposite of that of a normal person. An inverted man, it holds, is like a woman in being subject to the charm that proceeds from masculine attributes both physical and mental. He feels he is a woman in search of a man. But however well this applies to quite a number of inverts, it is, nevertheless, far from revealing a universal characteristic of inversion. There can be no doubt that a large proportion of male inverts retain the mental quality of masculinity, that they possess relatively few of the secondary characters of the opposite sex, and that what they look for in their sexual object are in fact feminine mental traits. If this were not so, how would it be possible to explain the fact that male prostitutes who offer themselves to inverts today just as they did in ancient times imitate women in all the externals of their clothing and behavior? Such imitation would otherwise inevitably clash with the ideal of the inverts. It is clear that in Greece, where the most masculine men were numbered among the inverts, what excited a man's love was not the masculine character of a boy, but his physical resemblance to a woman as well as his feminine mental qualities, his shyness, his modesty, and his need for instruction and assistance. As soon as the boy became a man, he ceased to be a sexual object for men and himself, perhaps, became a lover of boys. In this instance, therefore, as in many others, the sexual object is not someone of the same sex but someone who combines the characters of both sexes. There is, as it were, a compromise between an impulse that seeks for a man and one that seeks for a woman, while it remains a paramount condition that the object's body, i.e. genitals, shall be masculine. Thus the sexual object is a kind of reflection of the subject's own bisexual nature. Point 1. The position in the case of women is less ambiguous, for among them the active inverts exhibit masculine characteristics, both physical and mental, with peculiar frequency and look for femininity in their sexual objects, though here again a closer knowledge of the facts might reveal greater variety. Sexual aim of inverts. The important fact to bear in mind is that no one single aim can be laid down as applying in cases of inversion. Among men, intercourse per annum by no means coincides with inversion. Masturbation is quite as frequently their exclusive aim, and it is even true that restrictions of sexual aim to the point of its being limited to simple outpourings of emotion are commoner among them than among heterosexual lovers. Among women, too, the sexual aims of inverts are various. There seems to be a special preference for contact with the mucous membrane of the mouth. Conclusion. It will be seen that we are not in a position to base a satisfactory explanation of the origin of inversion upon the material at present before us. Nevertheless, our investigation has put us in possession of a piece of knowledge which may turn out to be of greater importance to us than the solution of that problem. It has been brought to our notice that we have been in the habit of regarding the connection between the sexual instinct and the sexual object as more intimate than it in fact is. Experience of the cases that are considered abnormal has shown us that in them the sexual instinct and the sexual object are merely soldered together, a fact which we have been in danger of overlooking in consequence of the uniformity of the normal picture, where the object appears to form part and parcel of the instinct. We are thus warned to loosen the bond that exists in our thoughts between instinct and object. It seems probable that the sexual instinct is in the first instance independent of its object, nor is its origin likely to be due to its object's attractions. B. Sexually immature persons and animals as sexual objects. People whose sexual objects belong to the normally inappropriate sex, that is, inverts, strike the observer as a collection of individuals who may be quite sound in other respects. On the other hand, cases in which sexually immature persons, children, are chosen as sexual objects are instantly judged as sporadic aberrations. It is only exceptionally that children are the exclusive sexual objects in such a case. They usually come to play that part when someone who is cowardly or has become impotent adopts them as a substitute, or when an urgent instinct, one which will not allow of postponement, cannot at the moment get possession of any more appropriate object. Nevertheless, a light is thrown on the nature of the sexual instinct by the fact that it permits of so much variation in its objects and such a cheapening of them which hunger, with its far more energetic retention of its objects, would only permit in the most extreme instances. A similar consideration applies to sexual intercourse with animals, which is by no means rare, especially among country people, and in which sexual attraction seems to override the barriers of species. One would be glad on aesthetic grounds to be able to ascribe these and other severe aberrations of the sexual instinct to insanity, but that cannot be done. Experience shows that disturbances of the sexual instinct among the insane do not differ from those that occur among the healthy and in whole races or occupations. Thus the sexual abuse of children is found with uncanny frequency among school teachers and child attendants, simply because they have the best opportunity for it. The insane merely exhibit any such aberration to an intensified degree, or, what is particularly significant, it may become exclusive and replace normal sexual satisfaction entirely. The very remarkable relation which thus holds between sexual variations and the descending scale from health to insanity gives us plenty of material for thought. I am inclined to believe that it may be explained by the fact that the impulses of sexual life are among those which, even normally, are the least controlled by the higher activities of the mind. In my experience, anyone who is in any way, whether socially or ethically, abnormal mentally is invariably abnormal also in his sexual life. But many people are abnormal in their sexual life who in every other respect approximate to the average, and have, along with the rest, passed through the process of human cultural development, in which sexuality remains the weak spot. The most general conclusion that follows from all these discussions seems, however, to be this. Under a great number of conditions and in surprisingly numerous individuals, the nature and importance of the sexual object recedes into the background. What is essential and constant in the sexual instinct is something else. Point 1. 2. Deviations in respect of the sexual aim. The normal sexual aim is regarded as being the union of the genitals in the act known as copulation, which leads to a release of the sexual tension and a temporary extinction of the sexual instinct, a satisfaction analogous to the sating of hunger. But even in the most normal sexual process we may detect rudiments which, if they had developed, would have led to the deviations described as perversions. For there are certain intermediate relations to the sexual object, such as touching and looking at it, which lie on the road towards copulation and are recognized as being preliminary sexual aims. On the one hand, these activities are themselves accompanied by pleasure, and on the other hand they intensify the excitation, which should persist until the final sexual aim is attained. Moreover, the kiss, one particular contact of this kind, between the mucous membrane of the lips of the two people concerned, is held in high sexual esteem among many nations, including the most highly civilized ones, in spite of the fact that the parts of the body involved do not form part of the sexual apparatus but constitute the entrance to the digestive tract. Here, then, are factors which provide a point of contact between the perversions and normal sexual life and which can also serve as a basis for their classification. Perversions are sexual activities which either a. Extend, in an anatomical sense, beyond the regions of the body that are designed for sexual union, or b. Linger over the intermediate relations to the sexual object which should normally be traversed rapidly on the path towards the final sexual aim. A. Anatomical extensions. Overvaluation of the sexual object. It is only in the rarest instances that the psychical valuation that is set on the sexual object, as being the goal of the sexual instinct, stops short at its genitals. The appreciation extends to the whole body of the sexual object and tends to involve every sensation derived from it. The same Overvaluation spreads over into the psychological sphere. The subject becomes, as it were, intellectually infatuated. That is, his powers of judgment are weakened by the mental achievements and perfections of the sexual object, and he submits to the latter's judgments with credulity. Thus the credulity of love becomes an important, if not the most fundamental, source of authority. Point 1. This sexual overvaluation is something that cannot be easily reconciled with the restriction of the sexual aim to union of the actual genitals, and it helps to turn activities connected with other parts of the body into sexual aims. Point 1. The significance of the factor of sexual overvaluation can be best studied in men, for their erotic life alone has become accessible to research. That of women, partly owing to the stunting effect of civilized conditions and partly owing to their conventional secretiveness and insincerity, is still veiled in an impenetrable obscurity. Point 2. Sexual use of the mucous membrane of the lips and mouth. The use of the mouth as a sexual organ is regarded as a perversion if the lips, or tongue, of one person are brought into contact with the genitals of another, but not if the mucous membranes of the lips of both of them come together. This exception is the point of contact with what is normal. Those who condemn the other practices, which have no doubt been common among mankind from primeval times, as being perversions, are giving way to an unmistakable feeling of disgust, which protects them from accepting sexual aims of the kind. The limits of such disgust are, however, often purely conventional. A man who will kiss a pretty girl's lips passionately may perhaps be disgusted at the idea of using her toothbrush, though there are no grounds for supposing that his own oral cavity, for which he feels no disgust, is any cleaner than the girl's. Here, then, our attention is drawn to the factor of disgust, which interferes with the libidinal overvaluation of the sexual object but can in turn be overridden by libido. Disgust seems to be one of the forces which have led to a restriction of the sexual aim. These forces do not as a rule extend to the genitals themselves. But there is no doubt that the genitals of the opposite sex can in themselves be an object of disgust, and that such an attitude is one of the characteristics of all hysterics, and especially of hysterical women. The sexual instinct in its strength enjoys overriding this disgust. See below P156F. Sexual use of the anal orifice. Where the anus is concerned, it becomes still clearer that it is disgust which stamps that sexual aim as a perversion. I hope, however, I shall not be accused of partisanship when I assert that people who try to account for this disgust by saying that the organ in question serves the function of excretion and comes in contact with excrement, a thing which is disgusting in itself, are not much more to the point than hysterical girls who account for their disgust at the male genital by saying that it serves to void urine. The playing of a sexual part by the mucous membrane of the anus is by no means limited to intercourse between men. Preference for it is in no way characteristic of inverted feeling. On the contrary, it seems that pedicatio with a male owes its origin to an analogy with a similar act performed with a woman, while mutual masturbation is the sexual aim most often found in intercourse between inverts. Significance of other regions of the body. The extension of sexual interest to other regions of the body, with all its variations, offers us nothing that is new in principle. It adds nothing to our knowledge of the sexual instinct, which merely proclaims its intention in this way of getting possession of the sexual object in every possible direction. But these anatomical extensions inform us that, besides sexual overvaluation, there is a second factor at work which is strange to popular knowledge. Certain regions of the body, such as the mucous membrane of the mouth and anus, which are constantly appearing in these practices, seem, as it were, to be claiming that they should themselves be regarded and treated as genitals. We shall learn later that this claim is justified by the history of the development of the sexual instinct, and that it is fulfilled in the symptomatology of certain pathological states. Unsuitable substitutes for the sexual object fetishism. There are some cases which are quite specially remarkable, those in which the normal sexual object is replaced by another which bears some relation to it, but is entirely unsuited to serve the normal sexual aim. From the point of view of classification, we should no doubt have done better to have mentioned this highly interesting group of aberrations of the sexual instinct among the deviations in respect of the sexual object. But we have postponed their mention till we could become acquainted with the factor of sexual overvaluation, on which these phenomena, being connected with an abandonment of the sexual aim, are dependent. What is substituted for the sexual object is some part of the body, such as the foot or hair, which is in general very inappropriate for sexual purposes, or some inanimate object which bears an assignable relation to the person whom it replaces and preferably to that person's sexuality, e.g. a piece of clothing or underlinen. Such substitutes are with some justice likened to the fetishes in which savages believe that their gods are embodied. A transition to those cases of fetishism in which the sexual aim, whether normal or perverse, is entirely abandoned is afforded by other cases in which the sexual object is required to fulfill a fetishistic condition, such as the possession of some particular hair coloring or clothing, or even some bodily defect if the sexual aim is to be attained. No other variation of the sexual instinct that borders on the pathological can lay so much claim to our interest as this one, such is the peculiarity of the phenomena to which it gives rise. Some degree of diminution in the urge towards the normal sexual aim, and executive weakness of the sexual apparatus, seems to be a necessary precondition in every case. Point 1. The point of contact with the normal is provided by the psychologically essential overvaluation of the sexual object, which inevitably extends to everything that is associated with it. A certain degree of fetishism is thus habitually present in normal love, especially in those stages of it in which the normal sexual aim seems unattainable or its fulfillment prevented. Schaff mir ein Hals touch von ihrer Brust, ein Strumpf band meiner Liebeslust. 1. The situation only becomes pathological when the longing for the fetish passes beyond the point of being merely a necessary condition attached to the sexual object and actually takes the place of the normal aim, and, further, when the fetish becomes detached from a particular individual and becomes the sole sexual object. These are, indeed, the general conditions under which mere variations of the sexual instinct pass over into pathological aberrations. Binet, 1888, was the first to maintain, what has since been confirmed by a quantity of evidence, that the choice of a fetish is an after effect of some sexual impression, received as a rule in early childhood. This may be brought into line with the proverbial durability of first loves, en revient toujours ses premiers amours. This derivation is particularly obvious in cases where there is merely a fetishistic condition attached to the sexual object. We shall come across the importance of early sexual impressions again in another connection, P242.2. In other cases, the replacement of the object by a fetish is determined by a symbolic connection of thought, of which the person concerned is usually not conscious. It is not always possible to trace the course of these connections with certainty. The foot, for instance, is an age-old sexual symbol which occurs even in mythology. One no doubt the part played by fur as a fetish owes its origin to an association with the hair of the Mons Veneris. Nonetheless, even symbolism such as this is not always unrelated to sexual experiences in childhood. Point 2. B. Fixations of preliminary sexual aims. Appearance of new aims. Every external or internal factor that hinders or postpones the attainment of the normal sexual aim, such as impotence, the high price of the sexual object, or the danger of the sexual act, will evidently lend support to the tendency to linger over the preparatory activities and to turn them into new sexual aims that can take the place of the normal one. Attentive examination always shows that even what seem to be the strangest of these new aims are already hinted at in the normal sexual process. Touching and looking. A certain amount of touching is indispensable, at all events among human beings, before the normal sexual aim can be attained. And everyone knows what a source of pleasure on the one hand and what an influx of fresh excitation on the other is afforded by tactile sensations of the skin of the sexual object. So that lingering over the stage of touching can scarcely be counted a perversion, provided that in the long run the sexual act is carried further. The same holds true of seeing an activity that is ultimately derived from touching. Visual impressions remain the most frequent pathway along which libidinal excitation is aroused. Indeed, natural selection counts upon the accessibility of this pathway if such a teleological form of statement is permissible one when it encourages the development of beauty in the sexual object. The progressive concealment of the body which goes along with civilization keeps sexual curiosity awake. This curiosity seeks to complete the sexual object by revealing its hidden parts. It can, however, be diverted, sublimated, in the direction of art, if its interest can be shifted away from the genitals onto the shape of the body as a whole. Too, it is usual for most normal people to linger to some extent over the intermediate sexual aim of a looking that has a sexual tinge to it. Indeed, this offers them a possibility of directing some proportion of their libido onto higher artistic aims. On the other hand, this pleasure in looking scopophilia becomes a perversion, A, if it is restricted exclusively to the genitals, or B, if it is connected with the overriding of disgust, as in the case of voyeurs or people who look on at excretory functions, or C, if, instead of being preparatory to the normal sexual aim, it supplants it. This last is markedly true of exhibitionists, who, if I may trust the findings of several analyses, one exhibit their own genitals in order to obtain a reciprocal view of the genitals of the other person. Point 1. In the perversions which are directed towards looking and being looked at, we come across a very remarkable characteristic with which we shall be still more intensely concerned in the aberration that we shall consider next. In these perversions the sexual aim occurs in two forms, an active and a passive one. The force which opposes scopophilia, but which may be overridden by it, in a manner parallel to what we have previously seen in the case of disgust, is shame. Sadism and masochism. The most common and the most significant of all the perversions, the desire to inflict pain upon the sexual object, and its reverse, received from craft heaping the names of sadism and masochism for its active and passive forms respectively. Other writers, e.g. Schrenk-Notzing, 1899, have preferred the narrower term algolagnia. This emphasizes the pleasure in pain, the cruelty, whereas the names chosen by craft heaping bring into prominence the pleasure in any form of humiliation or subjection. As regards active algolagnia, sadism, the roots are easy to detect in the normal. The sexuality of most male human beings contains an element of aggressiveness, a desire to subjugate. The biological significance of it seems to lie in the need for overcoming the resistance of the sexual object by means other than the process of wooing. Thus sadism would correspond to an aggressive component of the sexual instinct which has become independent and exaggerated and, by displacement, has usurped the leading position. Point 1. In ordinary speech the connotation of sadism oscillates between, on the one hand, cases merely characterized by an active or violent attitude to the sexual object, and, on the other hand, cases in which satisfaction is entirely conditional on the humiliation and maltreatment of the object. Strictly speaking, it is only this last extreme instance which deserves to be described as a perversion. Similarly, the term masochism comprises any passive attitude towards sexual life and the sexual object, the extreme instance of which appears to be that in which satisfaction is conditional upon suffering physical or mental pain at the hands of the sexual object. Masochism, in the form of a perversion, seems to be further removed from the normal sexual aim than its counterpart. It may be doubted at first whether it can ever occur as a primary phenomenon or whether, on the contrary, it may not invariably arise from a transformation of sadism to it. Can often be shown that masochism is nothing more than an extension of sadism turned round upon the subject's own self, which thus, to begin with, takes the place of the sexual object. Clinical analysis of extreme cases of masochistic perversion show that a great number of factors, such as the castration complex and the sense of guilt, have combined to exaggerate and fixate the original passive sexual attitude. Pain, which is overridden in such cases, thus falls into line with disgust and shame as a force that stands in opposition and resistance to the libido. Point 1. Sadism and masochism occupy a special position among the perversions, since the contrast between activity and passivity which lies behind them is among the universal characteristics of sexual life. The history of human civilization shows beyond any doubt that there is an intimate connection between cruelty and the sexual instinct, but nothing has been done towards explaining the connection, apart from laying emphasis on the aggressive factor in the libido. According to some authorities, this aggressive element of the sexual instinct is in reality a relic of cannibalistic desires, that is, it is a contribution derived from the apparatus for obtaining mastery, which is concerned with the satisfaction of the other and, ontogenetically, the older of the great instinctual needs to it has also been maintained that every pain contains in itself the possibility of a feeling of pleasure. All that need be said is that no satisfactory explanation of this perversion has been put forward, and that it seems possible that a number of mental impulses are combined in it to produce a single resultant. Point 3. But the most remarkable feature of this perversion is that its active and passive forms are habitually found to occur together in the same individual. A person who feels pleasure in producing pain in someone else in a sexual relationship is also capable of enjoying his pleasure any pain which he may himself derive from sexual relations. A sadist is always at the same time a masochist, although the active or the passive aspect of the perversion may be the more strongly developed in him and may represent his predominant sexual activity. Point 4. We find, then, that certain among the impulses to perversion occur regularly as pairs of opposites, and this, taken in conjunction with material which will be brought forward later, has a high theoretical significance. One, it is, moreover, a suggestive fact that the existence of the pair of opposites formed by sadism and masochism cannot be attributed merely to the element of aggressiveness. We should rather be inclined to connect the simultaneous presence of these opposites with the opposing masculinity and femininity which are combined in bisexuality, a contrast which often has to be replaced in psychoanalysis by that between activity and passivity. Point 2. 3. The perversions in general. Variation and disease. It is natural that medical men, who first studied perversions in outstanding examples and under special conditions, should have been inclined to regard them, like inversion, as indications of degeneracy or disease. Nevertheless, it is even easier to dispose of that view in this case than in that of inversion. Everyday experience has shown that most of these extensions, or at any rate the less severe of them, are constituents which are rarely absent from the sexual life of healthy people, and are judged by them no differently from other intimate events. If circumstances favor such an occurrence, normal people too can substitute a perversion of this kind for the normal sexual aim for quite a time, or can find place for the one alongside the other. No healthy person, it appears, can fail to make some addition that might be called perverse to the normal sexual aim, and the universality of this finding is in itself enough to show how inappropriate it is to use the word perversion as a term of reproach. In the sphere of sexual life, we are brought up against peculiar and, indeed, insoluble difficulties as soon as we try to draw a sharp line to distinguish mere variations within the range of what is physiological from pathological symptoms. Nevertheless, in some of these perversions the quality of the new sexual aim is of a kind to demand special examination. Certain of them are so far removed from the normal in their content that we cannot avoid pronouncing them pathological. This is especially so where, as, for instance, in cases of licking excrement or of intercourse with dead bodies, the sexual instinct goes to astonishing lengths in successfully overriding the resistances of shame, disgust, horror, or pain. But even in such cases we should not be too ready to assume that people who act in this way will necessarily turn out to be insane or subject to grave abnormalities of other kinds. Here again we cannot escape from the fact that people whose behavior is in other respects normal can, under the domination of the most unruly of all the instincts, put themselves in the category of sick persons in the single sphere of sexual life. On the other hand, manifest abnormality in the other relations of life can invariably be shown to have a background of abnormal sexual conduct. In the majority of instances the pathological character in a perversion is found to lie not in the content of the new sexual aim but in its relation to the normal. If a perversion, instead of appearing merely alongside the normal sexual aim and object, and only when circumstances are unfavorable to them and favorable to it if, instead of this, it ousts them completely and takes their place in all circumstances if, in short, a perversion has the characteristics of exclusiveness and fixation, then we shall usually be justified in regarding it as a pathological symptom. The mental factor in the perversions. It is perhaps in connection precisely with the most repulsive perversions that the mental factor must be regarded as playing its largest part in the transformation of the sexual instinct. It is impossible to deny that in their case a piece of mental work has been performed which, in spite of its horrifying result, is the equivalent of an idealization of the instinct. The omnipotence of love is perhaps never more strongly proved than in such of its aberrations as these. The highest and the lowest are always closest to each other in the sphere of sexuality. Vom Himmel durch die Welt zur Hölle 1. 2 conclusions. Our study of the perversions has shown us that the sexual instinct has to struggle against certain mental forces which act as resistances, and of which shame and disgust are the most prominent. It is permissible to suppose that these forces play a part in restraining that instinct within the limits that are regarded as normal, and if they develop in the individual before the sexual instinct has reached its full strength, it is no doubt they that will determine the course of its development. Point 2. In the second place we have found that some of the perversions which we have examined are only made intelligible if we assume the convergence of several motive forces. If such perversions admit of analysis, that is, if they can be taken to pieces, then they must be of a composite nature. This gives us a hint that perhaps the sexual instinct itself may be no simple thing, but put together from components which have come apart again in the perversions. If this is so, the clinical observation of these abnormalities will have drawn our attention to amalgamations which have been lost to view in the uniform behavior of normal people. Point 3. 4. The sexual instinct in neurotics. Psychoanalysis. An important addition to our knowledge of the sexual instinct in certain people who at least approximate to the normal can be obtained from a source which can only be reached in one particular way. There is only one means of obtaining exhaustive information that will not be misleading about the sexual life of the persons known as psychoneurotic sufferers from hysteria, from obsessional neurosis, from what is wrongly described as neurasthenia, and, undoubtedly, from dementia precox and paranoia as well. Point 1. They must be subjected to psychoanalytic investigation, which is employed in the therapeutic procedure introduced by Joseph Brewer and myself in 1893 and known at that time as catharsis. I must first explain, as I have already done in other writings, that all my experience shows that these psychoneuroses are based on sexual instinctual forces. By this I do not merely mean that the energy of the sexual instinct makes a contribution to the forces that maintain the pathological manifestations, the symptoms. I mean expressly to assert that that contribution is the most important and only constant source of energy of the neurosis, and that in consequence the sexual life of the persons in question is expressed whether exclusively or principally or only partly in these symptoms. As I have put it elsewhere, 1905e, postscript, this volume, p. 115, the symptoms constitute the sexual activity of the patient. The evidence for this assertion is derived from the ever-increasing number of psychoanalyses of hysterical and other neurotics which I have carried out during the last 25 years too, and of whose findings I have given, and shall continue to give, a detailed account in other publications. Point 3. The removal of the symptoms of hysterical patients by psychoanalysis proceeds on the supposition that those symptoms are substitutes, transcriptions as it were, for a number of emotionally connected mental processes, wishes and desires, which, by the operation of a special psychical procedure, repression, have been prevented from obtaining discharge in psychical activity that is admissible to consciousness. These mental processes, therefore, being held back in a state of unconsciousness, strive to obtain an expression that shall be appropriate to their emotional importance to obtain discharge, and in the case of hysteria they find such an expression, by means of the process of conversion, in somatic phenomena, that is, in hysterical symptoms. By systematically turning these symptoms back, with the help of a special technique, into emotionally cathected ideas that will now have become conscious, it is possible to obtain the most accurate knowledge of the nature and origin of these formerly unconscious psychical structures. Findings of psychoanalysis. In this manner the fact has emerged that symptoms represent a substitute for impulses, the source of whose strength is derived from the sexual instinct. What we know about the nature of hysterics before they fall ill, and they may be regarded as typical of all psychoneurotics, and about the occasions which precipitate their falling ill, is in complete harmony with this view. The character of hysterics shows a degree of sexual repression in excess of the normal quantity, an intensification of resistance against the sexual instinct, which we have already met with in the form of shame, disgust, and morality, and what seems like an instinctive aversion on their part to any intellectual consideration of sexual problems. As a result of this, in especially marked cases, the patients remain in complete ignorance of sexual matters right into the period of sexual maturity. Point 1. On a cursory view, this trait, which is so characteristic of hysteria, is not uncommonly screened by the existence of a second constitutional character present in hysteria, namely the predominant development of the sexual instinct. Psychoanalysis, however, can invariably bring the first of these factors to light and clear up the enigmatic contradiction which hysteria presents, by revealing the pair of opposites by which it is characterized: exaggerated sexual craving and excessive aversion to sexuality. In the case of anyone who is predisposed to hysteria, the onset of his illness is precipitated when, either as a result of his own progressive maturity or of the external circumstances of his life, he finds himself faced by the demands of a real sexual situation. Between the pressure of the instinct and his antagonism to sexuality, illness offers him a way of escape. It does not solve his conflict, but seeks to evade it by transforming his libidinal impulses into symptoms. Point 1. The exception is only an apparent one. When a hysteric male patient it may be falls ill as a result of some trivial emotion, some conflict which does not center around any sexual interest. In such cases, psychoanalysis is regularly able to show that the illness has been made possible by the sexual component of the conflict, which has prevented the mental processes from reaching a normal issue. Neurosis and perversion. There is no doubt that a large part of the opposition to these views of mine is due to the fact that sexuality, to which I trace back psychoneurotic symptoms, is regarded as though it coincided with the normal sexual instinct. But psychoanalytic teaching goes further than this. It shows that it is by no means only at the cost of the so-called normal sexual instinct that these symptoms originate. At any rate, such is not exclusively or mainly the case. They also give expression, by conversion, to instincts which would be described as perverse in the widest sense of the word if they could be expressed directly in fantasy and action without being diverted from consciousness. Thus symptoms are formed in part at the cost of abnormal sexuality. Neuroses are, so to say, the negative of perversions. Point 2. The sexual instinct of psychoneurotics exhibits all the aberrations which we have studied as variations of normal, and as manifestations of abnormal, sexual life. A. The unconscious mental life of all neurotics, without exception, shows inverted impulses, fixation of their libido upon persons of their own sex. It would be impossible without deep discussion to give any adequate appreciation of the importance of this factor in determining the form taken by the symptoms of the illness. I can only insist that an unconscious tendency to inversion is never absent and is of particular value in throwing light upon hysteria in men. Point 1. B. It is possible to trace in the unconscious of psychoneurotics tendencies to every kind of anatomical extension of sexual activity and to show that those tendencies are factors in the formation of symptoms. Among them we find occurring with particular frequency those in which the mucous membrane of the mouth and anus are assigned the role of genitals. C. An especially prominent part is played as factors in the formation of symptoms in psychoneuroses by the component instincts, one which emerge for the most part as pairs of opposites and which we have met with as introducing new sexual aims, the scopophilic instinct and exhibitionism, and the active and passive forms of the instinct for cruelty. The contribution made by the last of these is essential to the understanding of the fact that symptoms involve suffering, and it almost invariably dominates a part of the patient's social behavior. It is also through the medium of this connection between libido and cruelty that the transformation of love into hate takes place, the transformation of affectionate into hostile impulses, which is characteristic of a great number of cases of neurosis, and indeed, it would seem, of paranoia in general. The interest of these findings is still further increased by certain special facts. Point 1. A. Whenever we find in the unconscious an instinct of the sort which is capable of being paired off with an opposite one, this second instinct will regularly be found in operation as well. Every act of perversion is thus accompanied by its passive counterpart. Anyone who is an exhibitionist in his unconscious is at the same time a voyeur. In anyone who suffers from the consequences of repressed sadistic impulses there is sure to be another determinant of his symptoms which has its source in masochistic inclinations. The complete agreement which is here shown with what we have found to exist in the corresponding positive perversions is most remarkable, though in the actual symptoms one or other of the opposing tendencies plays the predominant part. B. In any fairly marked case of psychoneurosis it is unusual for only a single one of these perverse instincts to be developed. We usually find a considerable number and as a rule traces of them all. The degree of development of each particular instinct is, however, independent of that of the others. Here, too, the study of the positive perversions provides an exact counterpart. 5. Component instincts and erotogenic zones. 2. If we put together what we have learned from our investigation of positive and negative perversions, it seems plausible to trace them back to a number of component instincts, which, however, are not of a primary nature, but are susceptible to further analysis. Point 1. By an instinct is provisionally to be understood the psychical representative of an endosomatic, continuously flowing source of stimulation, as contrasted with a stimulus, which is set up by single excitations coming from without. The concept of instinct is thus one of those lying on the frontier between the mental and the physical. The simplest and likeliest assumption as to the nature of instincts would seem to be that in itself an instinct is without quality, and, so far as mental life is concerned, is only to be regarded as a measure of the demand made upon the mind for work. What distinguishes the instincts from one another and endows them with specific qualities is their relation to their somatic sources and to their aims. The source of an instinct is a process of excitation occurring in an organ, and the immediate aim of the instinct lies in the removal of this organic stimulus. Point 2. There is a further provisional assumption that we cannot escape in the theory of the instincts. It is to the effect that excitations of two kinds arise from the somatic organs, based upon differences of a chemical nature. One of these kinds of excitation we describe as being specifically sexual, and we speak of the organ concerned as the erotogenic zone of the sexual component instinct arising from it. Point 3. The part played by the erotogenic zones is immediately obvious in the case of those perversions which assign a sexual significance to the oral and anal orifices. These behave in every respect like a portion of the sexual apparatus. In hysteria these parts of the body and the neighboring tracts of mucous membrane become the seat of new sensations and of changes in innervation, indeed, of processes that can be compared to erection one in just the same way as do the actual genitalia under the excitations of the normal sexual processes. The significance of the erotogenic zones as apparatuses subordinate to the genitals and as substitutes for them is, among all the psychoneuroses, most clearly to be seen in hysteria, but this does not imply that significance is any the less in the other forms of illness. It is only that in them it is less recognizable, because in their case, obsessional neurosis and paranoia, the formation of the symptoms takes place in regions of the mental apparatus which are more remote from the particular centers concerned with somatic control. In obsessional neurosis what is more striking is the significance of those impulses which create new sexual aims and seem independent of erotogenic zones. Nevertheless, in scopophilia and exhibitionism the eye corresponds to an erotogenic zone. While in the case of those components of the sexual instinct which involve pain and cruelty the same role is assumed by the skin, which in particular parts of the body has become differentiated into sense organs or modified into mucous membrane, and is thus the erotogenic zone. Par excellence. Point 2. 6. Reasons for the apparent preponderance of perverse sexuality in the psychoneuroses. The preceding discussion may perhaps have placed the sexuality of psychoneurotics in a false light. It may have given the impression that, owing to their disposition, psychoneurotics approximate closely to perverts in their sexual behavior and are proportionately remote from normal people. It may indeed very well be that the constitutional disposition of these patients, apart from their exaggerated degree of sexual repression and the excessive intensity of their sexual instinct, includes an unusual tendency to perversion, using that word in its widest sense. Nevertheless, investigation of comparatively slight cases shows that this last assumption is not absolutely necessary, or at least that in forming a judgment on these pathological developments there is a factor to be considered which weighs in the other direction. Most psychoneurotics only fall ill after the age of puberty as a result of the demands made upon them by normal sexual life. It is most particularly against the latter that repression is directed. Or else. Illnesses of this kind set in later, when the libido fails to obtain satisfaction along normal lines. In both these cases the libido behaves like a stream whose main bed has become blocked. It proceeds to fill up the lateral channels which may hitherto have been empty. Thus, in the same way, what appears to be the strong tendency, though, it is true, a negative one, of psychoneurotics to perversion may be collaterally determined, and must, in any case, be collaterally intensified. The fact is that we must put sexual repression as an internal factor alongside such external factors as limitation of freedom, inaccessibility of a normal sexual object, the dangers of the normal sexual act, etc., which bring about perversions in persons who might perhaps otherwise have remained normal. In this respect different cases of neurosis may behave differently. In one case the preponderating factor may be the innate strength of the tendency to perversion, in another it may be the collateral increase of that tendency owing to the libido being forced away from a normal sexual aim and sexual object. It would be wrong to represent as opposition what is in fact a cooperative relation. Neurosis will always produce its greatest effects when constitution and experience work together in the same direction. Where the constitution is a marked one it will perhaps not require the support of actual experiences, while a great shock in real life will perhaps bring about a neurosis even in an average constitution. Incidentally, this view of the relative etiological importance of what is innate and what is accidentally experienced applies equally in other fields. If we prefer to suppose, nevertheless, that a particularly strongly developed tendency to perversion is among the characteristics of psychoneurotic constitutions, we have before us the prospect of being able to distinguish a number of such constitutions according to the innate preponderance of one or the other of the erotogenic zones or of one or the other of the component instincts. The question whether a special relation holds between the perverse disposition and the particular form of illness adopted, has, like so much else in this field, not yet been investigated. 7. Intimation of the infantile character of sexuality. By demonstrating the part played by perverse impulses in the formation of symptoms in the psychoneuroses, we have quite remarkably increased the number of people who might be regarded as perverts. It is not only that neurotics in themselves constitute a very numerous class, but it must also be considered that an unbroken chain bridges the gap between the neuroses in all their manifestations and normality. After all, Mobius could say with justice that we are all to some extent hysterics. Thus the extraordinarily wide dissemination of the perversions forces us to suppose that the disposition to perversions is itself of no great rarity but must form a part of what passes as the normal constitution. It is, as we have seen, debatable whether the perversions go back to innate determinants or arise, as Binet assumed was the case with fetishism p. 154, owing to chance experiences. The conclusion now presents itself to us that there is indeed something innate lying behind the perversions but that it is something innate in everyone, though as a disposition it may vary in its intensity and may be increased by the influences of actual life. What is in question are the innate constitutional roots of the sexual instinct. In one class of cases, the perversions, these roots may grow into the actual vehicles of sexual activity, in others they may be submitted to an insufficient suppression, repression, and thus be able in a roundabout way to attract a considerable proportion of sexual energy to themselves as symptoms, while in the most favorable cases, which lie between these two extremes, they may by means of effective restriction and other kinds of modification bring about what is known as normal sexual life. We have, however, a further reflection to make. This postulated constitution, containing the germs of all the perversions, will only be demonstrable in children, even though in them it is only with modest degrees of intensity that any of the instincts can emerge. A formula begins to take shape which lays it down that the sexuality of neurotics has remained in, or been brought back to an infantile state. Thus our interest turns to the sexual life of children, and we will now proceed to trace the play of influences which govern the evolution of infantile sexuality till its outcome in perversion, neurosis, or normal sexual life.